Ada for finally telling my neighbor to stop calling the cops on kids just for playing outside. I, 32F, moved into this neighborhood a few years ago, and honestly, it felt like I'd finally found a place to call home. Nestled in the suburbs, with streets lined with maple trees and driveways dotted with kids' chalk art, it was picturesque, the kind of community where people wave at each other while mowing the lawn or taking out the trash. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. The kind of home where the air is filled with the sounds of life, dogs barking at the mailman, sprinklers ticking on hot summer afternoons, and most prominently, the laughter of kids. My own sons, energetic and full of mischief, quickly joined the brigade of neighborhood kids. It was like a scene from one of those nostalgic movies where kids ride bikes in packs, play tag till their legs give out, and gather to kick around a soccer ball. They'd set up imaginary kingdoms and race on their scooters like their lives depended on it. Sure, it could get loud, but it was the kind of noise that brought joy, a symphony of childhood. At first, I thought everyone on the street appreciated this vibrancy, that the sounds of children playing were a universal delight. That was until I became acquainted with my neighbor. Let's call her Karen, though that name barely encapsulates her particular brand of hostility. Karen seemed to carry an air of perpetual discontent, the kind of person who could find fault with a cloudless day. Her house, immaculate to the point of sterility, sat like a fortress at the corner of the street, her blinds always drawn except for the occasional slit where her face would appear, watching, judging, and documenting every perceived infraction. The first time she called the cops on the kids, I was shocked. It had been a sunny Saturday afternoon, the kind that practically begs for kids to play outside. My sons, along with a group of other kids, had set up a game of tag. Their laughter echoed down the street, filling the air with an undeniable sense of joy. Then, like a record scratch, a police car pulled up. The officer, looking more bored than concerned, explained that someone had lodged a noise complaint. My immediate thought was that there must have been some mistake. Surely no one in their right mind would call the police over something so harmless. But then I saw her. Karen stood at her window, her face framed by the blinds, eyes narrowed like a hawk surveying prey. Her posture practically radiated satisfaction as she watched the scene unfold. I couldn't believe it. Who does that? What kind of person hears children laughing and thinks, this is intolerable? That first time, I let it slide. Maybe she was having a bad day. Maybe there was something deeper going on that I didn't know about. But then it happened again. And again. And again. 4 times in the span of a few months, Karen had called the police because, according to her, the kids were too loud. The pattern was clear. This wasn't about bad days or isolated incidents. Karen despised the very essence of what our street represented: life, laughter, community. It wasn't like the kids were out there at all hours of the night, screaming their heads off or blasting music. This was daylight, early evening at the latest. Normal, reasonable hours. And the noise? It was just kids being kids. Laughter, squeals of excitement, the occasional shouted tag, "You're it." It was the soundtrack of a healthy, happy neighborhood. But to Karen, it was an assault on her sensibilities. The thing that baffled me most was that this wasn't some retirement community with strict rules about noise and quiet hours. This was a regular suburban street, full of families and kids. She'd moved here knowing that. Did she expect the world to adjust to her preferences? To me, it was like moving next to an airport and complaining about the planes. The other parents on the street were just as frustrated as I was. We started to swap stories, piecing together Karen's history of complaints. It wasn't just the kids. She'd complained about dogs barking, leaves blowing onto her pristine lawn, and even the smell of someone's barbecue. She had a knack for taking the ordinary and spinning it into some grand personal offense. But the kids? That's where she seemed to draw her hardest line. She'd glare at them from her window, her lips pursed in disapproval, her phone seemingly glued to her hand, ready to call the authorities at the first sign of joy. It was like she had some vendetta against happiness itself. And while the other parents and I tried to brush it off, there was an underlying anger, a sense that her actions were more than just annoying, they were an attack on the very fabric of our community. So there we were, living our lives with this shadow looming over us, this constant tension that Karen might strike at any moment. I tried to stay patient, to keep my cool. But little did I know, the storm was brewing, and it was only a matter of time before it would all come to a head. Last night felt like déjà vu wrapped in frustration. The air was crisp, the kind of late spring evening where the scent of blooming flowers mingles with freshly cut grass, and the kids were reveling in it. They had congregated on our quiet suburban street, as they always did, their bikes weaving figure eights, their laughter punctuated by the occasional thud of a soccer ball meeting a shoe. It was a perfect slice of normalcy. Nothing out of the ordinary. No shouting matches, no blaring music, just the simple joy of childhood. I was watching from the porch, a mug of tea warming my hands, thinking about how rare moments like this could feel in today's world. My sons were chasing each other with a burst of competitive glee, while a few of their friends giggled on their scooters. It was innocent. Wholesome. And then, like clockwork, it happened. The telltale red and blue lights washed over the street, the quiet hum of the police car growing louder as it slowed to a stop. The mood shifted instantly. The kids froze, their playful shouts replaced by murmurs of confusion. One by one, their heads turned toward the squad car. My stomach sank. It wasn't even a question anymore, I knew who was behind this. My eyes snapped to the corner house, and there she was, Karen. Her pale face partially obscured by the blinds, her unmistakable silhouette framed like a painting of malcontent. She was watching, waiting, savoring the disruption she'd unleashed. This was the fourth time in just a few months, and I couldn't stay silent anymore. I set my mug down with a sharp clink and marched toward the officer, my pulse hammering in my ears. The frustration that had been simmering for months was now at a rolling boil. The officer stepped out of his vehicle, clipboard in hand, his expression weary. I could tell he didn't want to be here any more than I wanted him to be. He was probably thinking the same thing I was, not this again. What's the problem this time? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. I didn't care. The kids were now clustered together, their joy replaced with nervous glances. This was supposed to be their safe space, their sanctuary. And here we were again, having to justify their very existence. The officer sighed, his shoulders slumping. We got another noise complaint, he said, the words dripping with reluctance. His tone suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else, than mediating a situation that shouldn't even exist. I clenched my fists, the frustration bubbling over. A noise complaint? Are you kidding me? Look at them. I gestured toward the kids, who were now standing in a loose circle, their bikes propped up awkwardly on kickstands. They're just playing. Laughing. Being kids. Is that a crime now? The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly caught in the middle of a ridiculous situation. Ma'am, he began, but I didn't let him finish. No, I snapped, my voice rising. I'm not doing this again. This is the four times she's called the cops on kids for playing outside. How is this acceptable? How is this the best use of your time? It was then that Karen decided to make her grand entrance. She stepped out onto her porch, her arms folded tightly across her chest, her lips pressed into a thin, self-satisfied line. She looked exactly as I'd imagined she would, smug, as if she'd just won some moral victory. The sight of her made my blood boil. Is there a problem? She called out, her voice dripping with faux concern. It was the kind of tone that made it clear she thought she was the victim here, the martyr suffering in silence until she could bear it no longer. I spun to face her, the months of pent-up frustration spilling out in a torrent. Yes, there's a problem, Karen. The problem is you. You call the cops every time you hear kids laughing or playing like normal kids, and it's not okay. You're wasting everyone's time, including theirs. I pointed toward the officer, who looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Karen's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her posture stiff with indignation. I have a right to peace and quiet in my own home, she said, her voice rising. Not everyone wants to listen to a bunch of kids screaming all day. Screaming. I shot back, incredulous. They're laughing. Talking. Kicking a soccer ball around. They're not throwing a rave in your front yard. And you live in a neighborhood, Karen, not the middle of the woods. There are families here. Kids live here. What did you expect when you moved in? Her face reddened, but she wasn't done. I expected people to respect the rules. Noise ordinances exist for a reason. Maybe if you were a better parent, you'd teach your kids some manners. That did it. Any restraint I had left evaporated. Are you serious right now? You're going to lecture me about parenting when you're the one calling the cops on kids for laughing? Do you even hear yourself? You're the problem, Karen, not them. If the sound of kids playing bothers you this much, maybe the issue is you, not the neighborhood. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and crackling with tension. Karen's face twisted with anger, and she turned on her heel, storming back into her house. The door slammed shut behind her, rattling the windows. I stood there, breathing hard, the adrenaline coursing through me. The officer cleared his throat, drawing my attention back to him. Ma'am, he said carefully, I'm just here to respond to the complaint. There's not much I can do. I get it, I said, my voice softer now. But something has to give. This isn't fair to the kids, to the parents, to you. She's wasting everyone's time. He nodded, clearly sympathetic but powerless to change the situation. After a few more words exchanged, he left, the red and blue lights fading into the distance. The kids, sensing the tension had passed, hesitated for a moment before resuming their games, though the earlier carefree atmosphere had been dampened. As I walked back to my porch, I felt the weight of the evening settle over me. I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to back down quietly. And sure enough, by the next morning, she'd begun spreading her version of the story. Karen's face turned an angry shade of red as I let those words fly, the kind of red that can only come from years of unchecked entitlement meeting a wall of resistance for the first time. She jabbed a finger in my direction, her voice shrill and trembling with outrage. You have no idea what it's like to live here, day in and day out, listening to that racket. Maybe if you controlled your kids instead of letting them run wild, this wouldn't be an issue. I couldn't stop myself from laughing, not a laugh of humor, but one of sheer disbelief. Controlled? Are you kidding me? They're children, Karen, not inmates. Playing outside, laughing, and being kids is not running wild. You're the only one who seems to think it's a crime. Her eyes narrowed further, and she crossed her arms, shifting her weight in that telltale way that signaled she was gearing up for a tirade. I moved to this neighborhood for peace and quiet, not to listen to your kids screeching like banshees every evening. I pay my taxes, just like you do, and I have a right to enjoy my home without being subjected to constant noise pollution. I felt my blood boiling. You know what, Karen? We all pay taxes, and we all live here, too. And for your information, the world doesn't revolve around your preferences. Maybe if you stepped outside of your house once in a while, you'd realize that everyone else on this street thinks the kids are perfectly fine. The only one who has a problem is you. By now, other neighbors had started to come out of their houses, drawn by the escalating volume of our argument. A few stood at their porches, arms folded, watching like spectators at a tennis match. Others whispered to each other, no doubt speculating on how far this would go. Karen glanced around and seemed to realize she had an audience. She lifted her chin and raised her voice as if to rally support. I don't care what anyone else thinks. I have a right to live in peace. And you, she pointed at me with a dramatic flourish, are a bully. A loud, obnoxious bully who thinks it's okay to let her kids disrupt everyone else's lives. A few neighbors exchanged glances, some shaking their heads or rolling their eyes. It was clear that Karen wasn't winning any converts to her cause. If anything, her outburst only reinforced what everyone already knew, that she thrived on conflict and would stop at nothing to make herself the victim. Well, Karen, I shot back, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions roiling inside me. If standing up for the right of kids to play outside makes me a bully in your eyes, then so be it. But here's the thing, you don't get to police other people's happiness just because you're miserable. Maybe if you spent less time staring out your window and more time living your own life, you wouldn't feel the need to call the cops over something as ridiculous as laughter. That was the final blow. Karen's face contorted with a mixture of anger and frustration, and for a moment, it looked like she might say something else. But instead, she turned on her heel and stormed back into her house, slamming the door so hard that it rattled the windows. The street fell silent for a beat, the tension hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Then, slowly, the neighbors began to disperse, muttering to each other as they went. Some nodded at me in quiet support, while others cast wary glances toward Karen's house, no doubt wondering how long it would be before her next outburst. I stood there for a moment, my heart racing and my hands trembling. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, and I couldn't tell whether I felt triumphant, exhausted, or both. My boys had stopped playing and were standing near their bikes, looking at me with wide eyes. "Are we in trouble, Mom?" my youngest asked, his voice small. I knelt down, pulling both of them into a hug. "No, sweetheart. You're not in trouble. You didn't do anything wrong. You're just kids, and you have every right to play and be happy." They nodded, though they still looked a little unsure. I gave them a reassuring smile and sent them off to resume their game, though the carefree atmosphere from earlier was noticeably absent. It wasn't fair, not to them, not to any of the kids on the street. Karen's actions had cast a shadow over what should have been a simple, joyous evening. The next day, the fallout began. Karen, true to form, had wasted no time spinning her version of events. By the time I stepped out to grab the mail, I'd already received a text from one of the neighbors warning me that Karen was telling everyone she felt unsafe and verbally attacked during our confrontation. She was painting herself as the victim, conveniently omitting the part where she had called the police on a group of kids for no reason. Later that afternoon, I overheard her talking to another neighbor, her voice loud enough to carry across the street. She practically screamed at me, Karen was saying, her tone dripping with indignation. "I've never been so disrespected in my life. I'm just trying to maintain some peace and order around here, and she completely lost it on me. I don't know how anyone could think that's acceptable behavior." I wanted to march over there and set the record straight, but I knew better. Engaging with Karen again would only escalate the situation. Besides, I didn't need to defend myself to anyone who truly knew me. The neighbors who had witnessed the exchange the night before already understood what had happened, and most of them were on my side. Still, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. People started choosing sides, some openly supporting me and others tiptoeing around the issue, not wanting to get involved. A few even tried to play peacemaker, suggesting I apologize to Karen to keep the peace. But I refused. I wasn't going to apologize for standing up for my kids and every other child on this street. Karen, of course, continued her crusade. She filed yet another noise complaint a few days later, though this time, the officer who responded barely stepped out of his car before leaving. I could only imagine what the police department thought of her by now. Despite everything, I tried to move on. I encouraged the kids to keep playing outside, though I couldn't shake the nagging worry that Karen was watching, waiting for any excuse to strike again. But I refused to let her win. This was our neighborhood, too, and I wasn't about to let her ruin it. The battle wasn't over, but I was determined to stand my ground. For my kids. For the other parents. For the simple joy of laughter echoing through the street on a sunny afternoon. Karen could hide behind her blinds and her self-righteous indignation all she wanted, but she wouldn't silence us. Not now. Not ever. The days following the confrontation with Karen were a whirlwind of tension, gossip, and introspection. As expected, Karen wasted no time portraying herself as the neighborhood victim. She crafted a tale of harassment and verbal assault, making it sound as though I had lunged at her with a torrent of unprovoked insults. To hear her tell it, I was a menace, a loud, unruly parent whose children were the terror of the street. At first, I tried to brush it off. I knew Karen's penchant for exaggeration, and I was confident that most of the neighbors would see through her dramatics. But her persistence was exhausting. She began knocking on doors, repeating her grievances to anyone who would listen. She posted a long-winded rant on the community Facebook page, accusing me of being an unhinged bully who didn't respect anyone's boundaries. She even included veiled references to my children, implying they were out of control and that their behavior reflected a lack of proper parenting. It was infuriating, but more than that, it was disheartening. I began to wonder if I had indeed gone too far. Could I have handled things more diplomatically? Should I have ignored her antics instead of confronting her head-on? A few neighbors hinted as much, suggesting that I should have taken the high road. They weren't outright defending Karen, but they seemed uncomfortable with the public spectacle I'd created. Still, the majority of the neighborhood rallied around me. People stopped by to offer their support, some sharing their own stories of Karen's unreasonable behavior. One neighbor, an elderly man named Mr. Lewis, recounted how she had once complained about his wind chimes being too noisy. Another family revealed that she had threatened to report them for grilling in their backyard because the smell of barbecue invaded her space. It was clear that Karen's issues ran deeper than a simple dislike of kids playing outside. She thrived on control, and anyone who disrupted her carefully curated bubble was met with her wrath. Despite the support, the situation weighed heavily on me. Every time my kids went outside, I felt a gnawing anxiety, wondering if Karen was watching, waiting for the next excuse to strike. I didn't want my children to grow up feeling like they couldn't be themselves, but I also didn't want them to become targets of her ire. I was caught between protecting their joy and shielding them from her toxicity. Then, something happened that shifted the dynamic entirely. About a week after the confrontation, a letter arrived in my mailbox. It was from the police department, informing me that Karen had filed an official complaint against me for harassment. She claimed that my aggressive behavior had made her feel unsafe in her own home and that she was deeply concerned for her well-being. The letter was polite but firm, advising me to avoid any further confrontations and warning that continued conflict could result in legal action. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter crumpled in my trembling hands, tears of frustration welling up in my eyes. This wasn't just about noise complaints anymore. Karen was escalating the situation to a level I never anticipated. She was trying to paint me as the villain, turning a personal feud into a legal matter. It felt surreal, like I was trapped in a bad dream. But instead of crumbling under the pressure, I decided to fight back, not with anger, but with clarity and resolve. I contacted a lawyer to better understand my rights and responsibilities, and I began documenting everything. Every noise complaint, every interaction, every time Karen peeked through her blinds like a self-appointed neighborhood watchwoman. I wasn't going to let her weaponize the law against me without a fight. Word of the complaint spread quickly, and the neighborhood's support for me only grew stronger. Several neighbors wrote letters on my behalf, attesting to Karen's history of unreasonable behavior and supporting my account of the incident. One even submitted video footage from their doorbell camera, which captured the confrontation in full. The footage clearly showed that I hadn't threatened her or behaved aggressively. I had simply raised my voice in frustration, as anyone might under the circumstances. As the weeks went on, Karen's narrative began to crumble. The police, likely tired of her constant complaints, started taking her less seriously. The neighborhood grew increasingly united against her, with parents organizing playdates and outdoor activities as a show of solidarity. Karen's once pristine fortress became a symbol of isolation, a stark contrast to the sense of community blossoming around her. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Karen put her house up for sale. The for sale sign appeared without warning, its bold letters standing starkly against her immaculate lawn. At first, no one dared to believe it. Could she really be leaving? But as the weeks passed and moving trucks arrived, it became clear that Karen was retreating from the battle she had waged. Whether it was the strain of being ostracized or the realization that she couldn't bend the entire neighborhood to her will, she had decided to leave. The day she moved out, a quiet cheer rippled through the street. It wasn't a celebration of her departure, per se, but rather a celebration of the peace and unity that her absence promised. Without her watchful eyes and constant complaints, the neighborhood felt lighter, freer. In the weeks that followed, life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a dramatic chapter. The kids played outside without fear of police cars pulling up, their laughter echoing through the street once more. The neighbors grew closer, bonded by their shared experiences and the sense that they had triumphed over a common adversary. As for me, I learned a lot from the ordeal. I learned the value of standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. I learned that community is built not just on proximity, but on mutual support and understanding. And I learned that some battles are worth fighting not just for yourself, but for the people you care about. So, was I the asshole for snapping at Karen? Maybe. But looking back, I wouldn't change a thing. Sometimes, standing up to a bully is the only way to protect what matters most. And for me, that was the simple, irreplaceable sound of children laughing, playing, and being free.